So with that, move on to tonight's paper. Now, rumour has it, and I don't remember this, but rumour has it this paper originated with some idea of mine. Wouldn't this be an interesting idea to have a working party on when I chaired the Life Board? So very pleased to see that it's turned into a sessional meeting paper. The areas it's covering, in particular, deciding the appropriate copula and correlation assumptions and validation of the proxy model, are certainly two of the areas I find hardest in my day job when validating the internal model, in particular covering issues like how do you assess whether the fit of the proxy model is good enough when you don't know the right answer, how do you explain or assess whether it matters if there's a big difference in results from proxy and full models for one simulation. The simulation has risks in it that aren't large for your particular office. How do you judge how many out-of-sample tests to run to compare proxy and full models? And how do you know whether there are other simulations proxy model doesn't give a good fit that you just happen not to have looked at? And, you know, it's an area where I feel if you're validating a model, you continue to ask questions on and on if you want to, as David's probably suffered, and Steve actually, from me over time. So I'd like to introduce David Stevenson and Steve Oram, who are members of the Working Party, to introduce the paper. David was born and went to school in Thurso, which evidently also happened to be the birthplace of the first president of the Institute of Actuaries. He's got a BSc from University of Edinburgh and MSc PhD from University of Warwick and Mass. He's worked for Standard Life for over 20 years, including 4 in Frankfurt. And his first experience of applying stats in practice was a summer job as an undergraduate modelling the failure of fuel pins in a fast reactor core. So hopefully he had even less data for that than he does with our internal model. Don't know. Steve graduated from University of Dundee in 2007, BSc in mathematics. Since then he's worked for Standard Life in a variety of roles, currently in capital and risk management. So with that, I hand over to David and Stephen.
Okay. All right, thanks very much, Alistair. I don't think I glow in the dark anymore, but I did work in the fast reactor for 2 summer holidays. Today, I really wanted just to give initially a brief overview of the Working Party and a bit of background to its work, then move on to copulas. Particularly the issue of selecting correlations while allowing for tail dependence. And I would like to go through a worked example of one of the techniques that we describe in the paper, which I think is quite visual and I think is quite effective. And then I'll hand over to Stephen, who will say some words on proxy models. So a bit of background to what initiated the Working Party. Just let the feedback go down. So I guess the background really is the increasing sophistication in capital models that we've been seeing, partly motivated by Solvency II, which has the requirement to produce a full probability distribution forecast, and also a requirement that you can justify the assumptions on an empirical basis, as well as all the statistical quality standards, documentation standards, validation requirements that go around that. And really what that's led to has been a move away, at least for those firms who have been seeking internal model approval, to use more sophisticated aggregation techniques using simulation type models and proxy functions, moving away from the kind of correlation matrix approach getting applied to a capital vector that was quite common in the former ICAS regime. And with that background of statistical quality standards and the validation requirements, there's also the increasing scrutiny of the assumptions that go into this by stakeholders, the boards who overall are responsible for the quality of the internal model and it meeting the standards, and indeed the validation or the model validators themselves. So as a working party, our remit was to look into the different techniques that could be used, how actuaries could choose between the approaches, how those approaches could be validated and the results of that validation communicated to stakeholders. We weren't being asked to look at the relative technical merits of the techniques. That wasn't our main focus. So what we've produced, we think, is a survey of the current practices that we're aware of in use by UK life insurers within internal models at the moment, with some examples which we hope will be useful on how these approaches can be tested and the outcomes communicated. Our focus has been on the Copula and Proxy model approach because that really is the most widespread approach in the internal models that we understand have been approved to date. And we do hope that this will provide a useful reference document for actuaries who are working on internal models and perhaps those who are going to submit internal model applications in future. We're not claiming it's an absolutely foolproof and comprehensive toolkit. It's been very much based on the information that we've been able to collect, and would stress that you should use the techniques that are appropriate to your own circumstances. Not necessarily every technique that's described in the paper will be appropriate. So just to set the background, this is a picture of the kind of situation that we've been looking at. You've got marginal distributions, so these are statistical distributions that describe how your marginal distributions behave. We've got a dependency structure, a copula, that tells you how to glue these things together in a way that reflects the dependency structure that you assume. And those two things give you a way of simulating from a multivariate distribution of those risk factors. You then have a proxy model, which is a way of describing how your balance sheet behaves under each of those shocks. So you hit your proxy model with each of those shocks. You get a movement in own funds. You rank the movement in own funds, and at least for the purposes of Solvency II, you pick out the 99.5th percentile loss from that, and that's your SCR. So that's the basic idea. So moving on to the first element of those, copulas. I'm just going to give a brief reminder of what a copula is, a quick reminder of the Gaussian the student's T copula, a reminder of tail dependence, and that definition will then be used in the example of one approach to calibrating the correlations of a Gaussian copula. And if there's time, I might speak about top-down validation of the copula as well. So a copula, just briefly, is a distribution, a multivariate distribution on a unit hypercube. That's a technical definition with uniform marginals. Fundamentally, it's a recipe for gluing together the marginal distributions that you've defined in a way that reflects the underlying dependency structure. If you can simulate from the copula, you can get a value that lies between 0 and 1 for each risk factor, project that down onto the range of the CDF of the marginal distribution, project that, back solve then for the value of the marginal distribution that corresponds to, and do that for every component of the copula. You get yourself a vector. In other words, you've got a way of simulating from the multivariate distribution. So that's basically what a copula is doing. Most life companies that have had their internal models approved to date are using the Gaussian copula, the copula underlying the multivariate normal distribution. but there is a significant minority who are using a student's T copula. And I guess that choice has been influenced by a number of factors. One, just the transparency, or the balance between transparency and complexity of the copula. The use test, how easy is it to explain it to your stakeholders, continuity with the correlation matrix approach under the ICAS, a preference on whether you allow for tail dependence explicitly or implicitly, so a T copula does make an explicit allowance for tail dependence. And I guess as well, also the scarcity of data to support more complex models to calibrate these things. Calibration does rely primarily on expert judgment, given the lack of data, or even absence of data in some cases. So, given that, do you want to go for a more complex model, which is extremely difficult to justify, or do you use a more simple model, accept its limitations, but come up with a calibration that you can believe in, or at least feels that you can sufficiently rely on? So Gaussian copula, T copula, really this is just here to remind you that underlying both of these copulas is a correlation matrix. The T copula has an additional parameter, the degrees of freedom parameter, which acts to control tail dependence. The Gaussian copula has zero tail dependence. The student's T copula has non-zero tail dependence. And you can see that in this chart where the corners begin poking, or the contours begin poking into the corners. And you can also probably see that these things, they poke into the opposite corners as well, which is something called arachnitude, which Andrew Smith and his colleagues Gregory Spivak and I forget his first name, Shaw, introduced in a paper in 2010. So choosing correlation assumptions, well, I guess the typical situation is that data is scarce or even non-existent. Data typically exists only for market risk factors. Its uses are limited. It may not contain sufficient information about extreme events. Different time periods, if you look at the data over different time periods, those may suggest different values for the correlations. So it's essential to supplement the data with an expert judgment overlay. If there's no data, then you're forced to use expert judgment. So you're forced to think about things like causal effects, what happens if one risk factor moves, what does it do to the other. Underlying risk drivers, is there some kind of common risk factor that underlies both of them and therefore increases the tendency of a large movement in one to be accompanied by a large movement in another. Your own views on tail dependence, your own risk profile, that may affect which side of prudence you tend to err on. Your sensitivity to the assumption, if your balance sheet is very sensitive to that assumption, or your capital requirements are very sensitive to it, you're more likely to want to pay attention to the rationale underlying it. There are also things like internal consistency, whether the matrix you come up with is positive semi-definite, i.e. whether the correlations are internally consistent, and benchmarking against other companies in the industry. If you're an outlier, then is the reason for that sound. So one of the things that I wanted to introduce, because it will be used in an example that comes later, is this concept of the coefficient of finite tail dependence. So really what this is doing is looking at conditional probabilities. So you're looking at the probability that given that if one risk factor exceeds its quantile, then the other risk factor will exceed its quantile. That's the coefficient of upper tail dependence, and there's a similar definition for lower tail dependence. So the coefficient of lower tail dependence is broadly, for a given value of Q, it's the probability that's contained in that little square divided by the probability that's contained in that rectangle. And it doesn't matter which rectangle you choose, they both got the same probability in it. As I've actually used a slightly different definition to the normal one for reasons that you'll see later. It's basically, for the copulas we're looking at, if you replace Q by 1 minus Q in the usual definition, you get these two functions to coincide on the graphs. And you can come up with empirical versions of these as well by taking the number of points that actually lie in that little square. So you normalize them by dividing if you look at the number of points that lie in that little square and the number of points that lie in that rectangle, divide one by the other, you get the sample version of this. So how do these things look in practice? Well, the conditional probabilities for a Gaussian increase as you increase the correlation matrix. That's something, the correlation assumptions, that's something you would expect. They also tend to 0 as the quantile tends to 1, and that reflects the lack of tail dependence within the Gaussian copula. For the T copula, I've charted there a T copula with the same correlations but with 5 and 10 degrees of freedom, and what you see is that the tail dependence functions, these coefficients of finite tail dependence, get shoved up. So the conditional probabilities in the tail increase, and for the T copula they no longer tend to 0, they tend to a non-zero value. And why is tail dependence important? Well, this is an example that's been taken from the excellent textbook by McNeill, Fry and Edinburgh. It's important because the probability of simultaneous extreme values in 2 or more risk factors depends on the presence of tail dependence. So for example, here for a Gaussian copula with a 50% correlation assumption, simply by moving to a T copula with the same correlation assumption but with 5 degrees of freedom, you effectively double the probability of those two events, of those two risk factors exceeding their 99th percentile at the same time. So if you're looking at extreme events as you are for calculating capital requirements, the presence of tail dependence is something that you have to think about. Now, those companies that have used the Gaussian copula, which doesn't have explicit tail dependence in it, the approach they've tended to adopt is to adjust the correlation assumptions in some way to compensate for this effect. And an example of one of these ways I'll come on to later. So the data that we've looked at is a set of equity, credit spread and interest rate risk factors from end of 96 to end of 2014. That was 216 monthly movements in total. You can probably see, looking at equity credit, that there is some significant correlation there. There's probably a bit of tail behaviour going on as well, although that's more difficult to see from that chart. Looking at different time periods, this is a chart which shows the Spearman's rank correlation from the date on the x-axis to the last date of the period, that's the end of 2014. And as you can see, the correlation here does depend on time. We've plotted a 95% confidence interval around the central value. And if you look at the whole period, the correlation is probably around about minus 45%, and maybe broadly a 10 to 15% band either side of that for the confidence interval. So that might be helpful in informing your best estimate view of what the correlation would be. Another technique that's sometimes used is to look at rolling correlations over shorter time periods. And here we've charted equity and credit over a window of 24 months, a rolling window of 24 months. And you can probably see from the chart that the correlation reached around about minus 75% after the financial crisis in 2008-2009. Another technique would be to use some of the statistical fitting techniques. There are a couple of variants on these. One is a kind of version of the method of moments, where you calculate your sample data and you calculate a statistic from your sample data and you choose the parameters of your model to match those. So things like the inverse Spearman, inverse Tau techniques can be used here, although if you've got a T copula, they don't solve for the degrees of freedom. You have to estimate that using maximum likelihood. And there's something called maximum pseudo likelihood. That is where you normalize your observations by dividing the ranks by n plus 1, where n's the number of observations you've got. That gives you something that lies strictly between 0 and 1. You evaluate the copula density function at those observations and form the likelihood function and optimize that in the usual way, and there are standard packages that do that. If you apply that to the data for pairs of risks using R, this was what we came up with. I think the key point to take away from this, I think, is that if you're looking at the Gaussian and T copula, there's a relatively small change in the correlation assumption, but for equity credit, the degrees of freedom parameter is quite small. It's 3, which is possibly an indicator of quite strong tail dependence, so something that you might want to look at further. So I wanted to go on to an example of one of the techniques in the paper, which, if you have chosen to use a Gaussian copula, you might then use to inform how much you would want to add on to your best estimate view of a correlation to allow for the tail dependence that's present. This is actually based on some joint work with Stephen Macon, but it goes back to ideas that were presented in the paper by Gary Venter, who's a general insurance actuary working in the USA. So he did something on this in 2003, which gave us the idea. There are other techniques available. This is just one of them. For example, if you're for a student's T copula, there's a technique that's based on matching higher rank invariants, such as arachnitude, and that's been described in a paper by Shaw Smith and Spivak in 2010. And there is what I think is, I found a rather interesting paper by Andrew Smith, which is in preprint at the moment, which talks about the theory of that, but that's just me. So, how does this approach work? Well, what it does is you take your data and plot the empirical coefficients of tail dependence, the empirical conditional probabilities that I described earlier. So I've actually multiplied the equity returns in this example by -1, so that we're looking at the tails where equity values fall and credit spreads increase, or equity values rise and credit spreads reduce. So the gold ones are the tails where equity values fall and credit spreads increase, and that's the one, I guess, which most firms will be exposed to. And there's some evidence of asymmetry there, so that might suggest that a Gaussian copula is perhaps not entirely appropriate. You then draw on top of that the coefficient of the finite tail dependence for your chosen model, and in this case it's a Gaussian model, and I've used a correlation assumption of 50% here because that was roughly what came out of the maximum pseudo likelihood estimation. And as you can see, the red line does drop towards 0, and it falls short of the gold circles in the tails. And you can draw a confidence interval around that. I've used bootstrapping techniques. The bootstrapping, basically that's 5,000 simulations of 216 observations from a Gaussian copula with the chosen correlation assumption. And if you find that values tend to lie outside that confidence interval, then that may be an indicator that actually that fit is not so good. And then you can play around with this. You can change the assumptions that you put in. So this was moving the correlation assumption to 60%, and you can see that if I get it right, that the red line moves up and the confidence interval moves up as well. So if you have a rough idea of where your biting scenario is, i.e. the kind of scenarios that give rise to your SCR, and if you have an idea of what the direction of these risks that you're exposed to, you can play around with these kind of charts and form a judgment on which correlation assumption you think best reflects the point in the tail where you're at or where you want to be. So in this case, I guess if you were exposed to spreads up and equity returns down, and you had a biting scenario of maybe between 90 and 95th percentile, then maybe something of the order of 70% might be okay. Maybe 80% is overshooting it a little, but 70% seems kind of broadly in the range in the tail. I guess one thing to note from that is that results in adding on 20 percentage points to what you might have thought was a best estimate correlation, and that is well in excess of the confidence interval that you may have chosen based on that previous chart. So don't rely on confidence intervals alone. It's really the conditional probabilities that you have to worry about. And even then, you've still got pretty sparse data in the tail. So even once you've used these techniques, you do have to think about the other factors that I mentioned earlier and overlay this with expert judgment in order to come up with your final view on the correlation assumptions. I've just noted there some of the strengths and limitations of this approach. I guess the key strength for me was that it is highly visual, and you can stick these charts in front of people and have a conversation with them. and it is relatively straightforward for a Gaussian copula. Limitations, it doesn't really generalise very easily to other copulas. You still have to overlay it with expert judgment, and it only does look along the 45-degree ray, i.e. you're assuming the same percentiles for both risks. Now, you could try and broaden that by looking at ratios of instead of using that little square, you could use a little rectangle, but that's perhaps overly complex. And I guess I'll skip that slide, that very last slide, because we're kind of limited for time, and I'll hand over to Stephen.
Thank you, David. So a proxy model is really just a model of the results produced by the full actuarial model suite, which is itself a model of reality. They were first used to partner copulas, as David was saying, in simulation-based aggregation methods for calculations of capital requirements, an example of which is the Solvency II SCR. Here, a copula is used to generate thousands or potentially millions of scenarios. The proxy model can then be used to calculate the balance sheet impact of each scenario quickly, which would not be possible using full models with current technology. And then losses from all scenarios are ranked, and the SCR can be read off as the 1 in 200 event, say. Proxy models have since been extended to other uses, though, such as solvency monitoring. The key stages in building and using a proxy model are design, which takes place up front with periodic reviews, calibration, or in other words, fitting the proxy model, and validation, which is testing how well fitted it is. Calibration and validation may be performed within the reporting cycle, but some firms seek to do elements of these off-cycle in order to meet reporting timescales. There are many technical choices in the design and calibration of a proxy model, which we do touch on in the paper, but the key focus is really on validation, or how good is the proxy model at replicating the results of the full model, and that's what stakeholders will be interested in. With regard to validation then, it is key that it takes into account the uses of the proxy model. So for example, it will likely be used to calculate aggregate capital requirements such as the SCR, which is based on the results of thousands or millions of scenarios, as described previously. And it may also be used to estimate balance sheet impacts based on evaluating individual scenarios in the proxy model following month-to-month or even day-to-day market movements. Each use relies on the proxy model being well fitted at different points of the probability distribution forecast. And typically, the adversity of scenarios which will be used to estimate the balance sheet response to short-term market movements will not be the same as those which affect the SCR. And the consequence of the fitting errors will be different for each purpose too. It is therefore important to take into account the use of the model when performing validation. Validation should also tell us something about the proxy model fit, and it should be possible to investigate any issues by identifying which parts of the model are responsible for the errors observed, and also to provide information for future refinements. It is vital that validation meets the needs of stakeholders, that it provides clear information on the performance of the proxy model and draws clear conclusions on its suitability for use. And finally, it must be practical to perform within the timescales required for reporting results. A key type of validation is out-of-sample testing. Here, a firm runs the same scenarios through its proxy model and full actuarial model suite, which are also known as heavy models, in order to compare the results. Graphical display of results as a scatter plot, as shown, can be informative, and these can help to show at a glance how the proxy model performs at different points of the loss distribution and can highlight issues which may be missed by summary statistics alone. Here, a perfect fit is reflected by points on the dashed 45-degree line indicating the proxy model and full model give the same result for a scenario. Points on either side of the line indicate misstatements, and it is good practice to consider the users of charts like this when creating them and highlight and make it clear whether the proxy model is understating or overstating results as shown on this example. Then examination of the chart can indicate fitting issues such as clear outliers or scenarios with single large errors. And the firm may wish to investigate these to determine if it's a genuine error or a testing error. If it is a genuine error, by itself it may not give cause for concern. For example, if it is a single point which occurs at a particular extreme combination of risks. But a firm will want to know if it is indicative of a more systematic issue. On this slide, the chart illustrates a possible systematic issue, which is that losses are overstated around the origin. This could affect the ability of the proxy model to accurately reflect short-term movements such as those required for balance sheet estimation or solvency monitoring, and it's something a firm would want to look into further, potentially depending on the materiality. So a firm will aim to use its out-of-sample testing and other validation to answer two questions. First, is the model suitable for use? And the answer may differ for different purposes. Also, can the model be improved, either within the current cycle or in the future? We note that summary statistics, such as the mean or maximum error, can be informative, but shouldn't be the only source of information. And statistics alone will rarely diagnose a fitting issue. Given tight timescales, tolerances can be invaluable in making objective decisions quickly and identifying areas which require further investigation. However, if these investigations do identify a limitation in proxy model fit during the reporting cycle, it's unlikely that a firm will have the opportunity to perform additional modelling to rectify it. And as a consequence, firms have adopted methods which use the results of out-of-sample testing to refine their proxy model calibration. And we've outlined a number of such methods, of which we are aware in the paper. Ultimately, proxy models add an additional layer of approximation to the reported results, and a firm's validation can be used to understand and communicate the potential error around the true result, which is caused by the proxy model. So, to conclude, I've touched on a number of considerations for validating proxy models, but it's worth drawing out a key point of proxy modelling, which is that errors are expected, but bias and trends in errors are not. Validation should therefore focus on identifying these issues and provide output which enables stakeholders to gauge the potential impact on the end results. And as we have seen, visual inspection can be valuable, both when performing validation and as a communication tool. With that, I'll hand back over to Alistair.
Right, thanks, Stephen. So I'd like to introduce Jonathan Pears now to open the discussion. Jonathan is Chief Actuary at Standard Life, where he's worked for, I don't know, ages longer than me, so before 2002 anyway. Jonathan he carelessly didn't send anything in beyond that, so things I'm going to say to Jonathan, he sings in a choir, but also has at least one of his sons who shouts and screams for him to I don't know, shut up, but be quiet when he sings in the car when they're driving along. I get the pleasure of reviewing Jonathan's recommendations for the internal model as part of my day job, and they're usually pretty good, so I'm expecting great things from his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Alistair, and I hope that no one will be shouting shut up as I give these comments. I'd like to start by thanking David and Stephen and the rest of the working party for the work that they've done on this this paper. I mean, it is a huge amount of effort to do the work behind the scenes to produce a paper like this, and has involved giving up a lot of weekends and hard work to actually get to this point. So I'm very much appreciative of the work that's gone into it. I did find the paper a very good read. It does the kind of quite amazing thing of dealing with some really quite technical areas and diving down into them whilst remaining quite accessible and very relevant. I also found that it provides a great deal of very practical advice for those trying to do this type of modelling, and I'm sure it will be, as David hoped at the beginning, be a useful reference, having collected a lot of techniques together. The paper addresses a number of important themes. I mean, as the authors point out, the choice of the model and assumptions on dependency structure and the approach to aggregation can have really very big financial impacts and therefore potentially drive different action. I'm quite struck how, if you go back to the old approach in the ICA of looking at individual risk factors, applying a correlation, and then maybe adjusting to come up with an answer, probably the biggest single number on the capital balance sheet was the diversification. But looking back to that, the amount of explanation of the judgments involved was probably relatively low compared with the very significant impact that it has. Given the very limited data and the questions of the relevance of historic data, there is necessarily a significant degree of judgment in the choices that are being made here. And so consequently the communication of those judgments, the limitations and the consequences of using alternative approaches is hugely important here, but it's far from easy. So I think the paper addresses these important themes quite well. The first theme that I'll touch on, which is common to both sections of the paper, the section on dependency and on proxy modelling, is that of the high degree of judgment that's required in any sort of model that's trying to approximate reality. The authors bring out, amongst other things, the scarcity of relevant data, features of the data that change over time. So if you look at the kind of work on estimating correlations, you'll find in some periods they can be positive, in other periods negative. There's a need for the model to be relevant as a forward-looking model, and yet you're using historical data. So it needs to be relevant to the current environment, post-referendum, rather than the past. And therefore, the reliance that can be placed on past data is inevitably limited. And then, models that fit well in some parts of the distribution may be a poor fit in others, and that requires choices that are related then to the use that the model's put. And I think another point that's brought out very well is that the more features that the model tries to explain, the more relevant data is then needed, and therefore there is the potential risk of spurious results and inappropriate confidence unless these choices are properly explained. So consequently, while the results and the uses of the model are informed by data and modelling, it's very important to recognise that ultimately the result is highly dependent on the choices and judgment involved, and not be fooled into thinking that there is that by doing lots of work and modelling that you have in some way some perfect answer. So that brings me on to the second theme, which is that of communication. And again, this is assessed well or looked at well in both sections of the paper. I've spent a great deal of time over the last sort of 3 or 4 years trying to explain to boards and regulators the choices that are involved in models, the limitations and the judgments. And it is not easy to both give confidence in what you're doing, come to a practical solution, but at the same time really have people understand the judgments that are being made. So I agree with the authors on the importance of this, and that this is a fundamental part of the role of everyone working on the development of the models, not just those who are explaining the results to the board, but everybody to actually think through actually what are the consequences of the judgments that you're making in informing the recommendations involved. So given the technical nature of some of the judgments, it does take a great deal of hard work to get this right for the many different stakeholders that are involved, who clearly have different needs, a different level of familiarity with the material, and whose appetite for engagement will differ a lot. And I found that the authors provided some helpful suggestions in both sections of the paper to deal with this. Turning to the section of the paper on the dependency structure, I thought I would leave to others in the audience maybe to raise some of the more sort of statistical points and so on. What I found was that this did provide a very good reference material on the practical options for modelling dependency and the consequences of the choices involved. The material that David took us through on allowing for tail dependency, illustrated very well, I think, the significance of the choices here, and also provided a practical approach to dealing with that. The paper also provides a number of practical suggestions on the high-level top-down validation and on the communication of the results and the implementation of the implications of choices. One suggestion that the paper gives is asking users to define a bad scenario and then asking what probability your model puts on an event at least as bad as that. This, of course, leads to the question of what do you mean by as least as bad as some scenario that you've postulated. The authors suggest using that, of course, you've got a measure with your capital model there, and you can ask what's the probability that of a loss bigger than the loss that your model produces there. This approach has the benefit of making the results, kind of relevant to your risk profile, but is perhaps not necessarily the most intuitive in terms of just looking at the events. And so I do wonder if there are other simple forms of sort of distance and how bad scenarios are that could be used to help users understand what at least as bad means and get a feeling for the choices that are being made. I personally particularly like the use of representative scenarios that the authors suggest as a method of illustrating the overall implications of the dependency structure. So here you're saying what is a scenario equivalent to, say, the 1 in 200, and this enables you to look at what are the risks that make that up. This enables you to both understand what are the risks that the model is saying, get a view of whether they're sensible, but also as you track this through time, you can see the implications of changes in methodology, changes in the environment, and so on, and changes just generally in the risk profile over time. Finally, turning to the section on proxy modelling, the need for proxy models, as Stephen brought out, arises really from the insufficient computing power used by insurers to actually run the heavy models, the millions of times needed to simulate losses and calculate the distribution. So this really is, as Stephen says, adding another layer of approximation onto an already approximate approach to make up for the lack of computing power. And our experience has been that getting happy with the results of this has been quite involved and has resulted in using most of the techniques mentioned in this paper. And as Alistair said, this is kind of one of the hardest areas to get your head around. You can see things which intuitively look sensible, but you're always worried about weird counterexamples, and for every theory about why this is right, you can come up with if this happened, then you can see how a problem could arise. one of the challenges that's brought out is that if you look at the simulated, all the scenarios close to the 99.5th percentile, through your out of sample testing or whatever, there will be some scenarios which are inevitably very extreme in one variable and very extreme in the other direction in another. And you can get, as a result of that, some very poor fits. And the paper brings out reasons why very quickly you can get poor fits by fitting a function in one area, and then of course it disappears off in the areas you haven't modelled. So intuitively this doesn't matter so long as the fit for the area where the weight of scenarios is good and the ranking is okay and so on. And so you feel that you ought to be able to sort of demonstrate and prove what really matters and therefore get to a good outcome there. The authors suggest setting a materiality limit for the use of proxy models and then working out how to fit the needs to achieve this. I think this is a sensible approach, but have found this difficult in practice, as it isn't clear how large, say, an out-of-sample error can be tolerated without affecting the result. If the errors are random, then they don't matter, and you can prove that. But of course, by construction, they're not random. Hence the need for a range of approaches to understand the consequences of limitations and so on. So this feels like an area where there is plenty of scope for further work in terms of practical approaches to getting comfortable with the output of the models. Or perhaps this is really just simply an issue of faster computers and better processing to actually remove this approximation altogether. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank the authors again for a very stimulating paper that provides a good practical starting point and reference and covers a wide range of important themes. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Jonathan. So I'd now like to open the discussion to the floor, encourage all of you who may want to contribute to do so. For no other reason that those of us who work at Standard Life can count this as an external CPD, not internal as it probably is at the moment. Reminder that the meeting is being recorded, so please clearly state your name before making the contribution. Wait for a microphone to be brought to you, speak into the microphone and stand up. So with that, who would like to make a contribution? Sooner or later it's going to have to be you, Andrew, the looks of it.
Big microphone. Hello, my name's Andrew Smith. I'm a visitor from the south. Thank you for your hospitality. I'd like to start actually by answering one of the questions that Jonathan posed about is there a measure of how extreme a particular combined scenario is that doesn't depend on a particular firm's proxy model? And the answer is yes. And the measure is called half-space depth, and Tukey came up with it in the 1950s, and Rousseau and Rutz gave some really good algorithms in the 1990s. And there's a paper in IME by Alex McNeil and myself showing applications to Solvency II internal models. So got that out of the way. Now back to the paper. So one of the things I like about this paper is that it provides a really good summary of what's going on in the industry. And not everything that is done in practice has a rigorous justification. But it's still helpful to know what others are doing, not least because regulators have benchmarks, and it's quite nice to have your own view of where you sit relative to other benchmarks. There's been lots of papers on model building, so I'm really pleased to see something that's on testing and communication. I think that's an area that's been neglected. I'm going to make one really obvious observation, focusing on the copula section. And I looked at, there's a table, you don't have to turn to it now, table 314 of ways of testing copulas. And the obvious point is that all of those ways of testing copulas are numerical methods based on past data. They're ways of seeing if a particular proposed model fits the data. But then it's strangely disconnected from the table that's given of methods of fitting copulas, which includes the finite tail dependence and includes the magnitude method and includes some variance of maximum likelihoods. There's lists of strengths and limitations. It's table 311 if you really want to look at it. There's lists of strengths and limitations, but they're all sort of ease of use and challenges in numerical implementation. And there didn't seem to be any tests that actually told you whether one method was better than another, apart from kind of the ease of running it and running some computer code and how often does it fall over. Now, David has said that they deliberately didn't go into the technical merits of different methods, but in a paper on testing, that seems to me to be a little bit of a gap that I'd like to see more work on. What kind of tests can you do that tells you whether the method generally is working or not? And the kind of tests you might have in mind, so in the examples they've got, I think there's 16 years of monthly data. So you might generate 17 years of monthly data and fix your model using these 3 different methods, get 3 different ersatz models based on 16 years data, then see what happened in year 17, compare it to the percentiles that came to your model and say which one works best. Things like that, the tests on generated data, I think, would be a useful addition because it would enable us to get a quantitative way of ranking the different alternatives. And those methods, incidentally, are used in other areas of financial endeavour and back testing in investment banks. It's quite widely used in general insurance for testing bootstrap methods, so it wouldn't be an entirely new idea. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank the authors for this paper and the enormous amount of hard work that's gone into them. It's really handy to have documentation of industry practice. Of course, there is always a danger of groupthink, and the danger of industry practice is it's entirely possible that several people are independently doing the same wrong thing, in which case benchmarking can potentially be misleading. So I hope there'll be some future research that produces more absolute quantification of model strengths and weaknesses. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. David or Stephen, are there any points you want to make on what Andrew said?
Other than to say that I agree, it would be nice, but there's only so much time that we had to produce it. But yes, I agree with that point, and it's one of the things that perhaps we should think about for further work.
Anyone else like to make a contribution or ask a question?
Thanks, Ian Rogers. So I was interested, David, in your section on adjusting for tail dependence and potentially increasing the correlations to allow for observed tail dependence. And then Stephen went on to talk about the use of the model and fitting, looking at your fit in different areas depending on what the model was going to be used for. I kind of wondered about whether you would advocate having a sort of 2 versions of your correlation assumptions, one for the near the origin section where you're likely to be using it for calibrating a risk appetite buffer, and another for out in the sort of extreme tail for solvency capital purposes, or whether that's, too much complexity and it would be better to come up with a blended approach that works somewhere in the middle but not so well at either. Yeah, interesting thoughts along those lines.
Well, I think that is a good point. I think it depends on what you want to use the model for. And I think it also depends on the impact that it does have. So if you have calibrated, chosen your correlation assumptions to be appropriate for the tail of the distribution, then it is something that perhaps you should investigate, is sensitivities to changing those correlation assumptions and the impact not only on the tail of the distribution but of other parts. If it's not something that is going to change your decision making after looking at those sensitivities, then perhaps you can live with those stronger correlation assumptions. But if it is something that could potentially affect the decisions you make, then I think you're right, and perhaps you do want to, for those purposes, you may want to run your model on a different set of correlation assumptions. At any rate, you absolutely should make sure that the users of the model are aware of these choices and the potential impacts that they do have, so that they can make an informed choice on whether to adjust the assumptions when they're using them.
Any more questions or comments? The downside of that is I'll go through my long list of questions. David.
Thanks. If I was a non-technical member of a board, which I increasingly am nowadays, I would be asked, and Jonathan's referred to the difficulties in communicating results to boards, I'd be asking what sort of difference would these techniques be making to the overall answer? So we're talking about 1% difference, we're talking about 5, 20, 50, how much difference, what sort of quantum are we talking about here? I think very helpful to understand that. And maybe, I shouldn't be asking the questions, but what sort of approaches has the opener adopted when explaining to non-technical members of the board how to understand these new techniques and these new models?
Quantum of difference. I think that depends on how your balance sheet actually responds. One of the basic assumptions of using a correlation matrix approach is that your balance sheet responds in a linear fashion to the shocks and the risk factors. So one of the reasons for going down this simulation and proxy model-based approach was to effectively bring in the non-linear response of the balance sheet into the derivation of the distribution. So I think it does depend on the extent of non-linearity in that response. I've seen some examples, and they are fairly extreme, of some kinds of risks, operational risk being one, which is extremely long-tailed, and where assuming a linear response function compared to something that does reflect the very non-linear response of operational risk and the severity of operational risk in the tails can make actually quite a significant difference, possibly of the order of 20%, if I remember rightly. So it can be significant. Of course, with a correlation matrix approach, a typical method to adjust or allow for these limitations was to run a scenario which was calibrated using the underlying assumptions of normality. Come up with a scenario, run that through your heavy models, and use that scenario to adjust the result of the correlation matrix approach to adjust for this non-linearity. So that isn't actually something that we did as part of this work, but it might be an interesting exercise to do, just in a toy example, to see where that gets you.
Yeah, in terms of then communicating this, I mean, I would say the sort of material that David has put in the paper is probably the level that we would use with our sort of technical committee, so sort of the senior people kind of getting happy with the model and that it is then fit to be recommended. In terms of the board, the approach that we've taken is probably kind of building over time. So we've done, as sort of in advance of internal model, quite a lot of training sessions, which would, kind of really start with, why do we want to go down this route? What advantages does it bring? What were we missing in the simpler approaches? Bringing out the fact that these choices, as David said, could make, say 20%, perhaps even more. I mean, you saw how the large amount that allowing for tail dependency added to the correlation. So you can see that how that quickly could clock up. We'd also sort of focus. One of the things that we found was that actually the sort of approach that people were traditionally using, which was to use a correlation matrix and then say, okay, a correlation matrix has limitations, so we'll then make adjustments for that, was actually coming up with those adjustments was becoming completely impractical, because, and you could fairly quickly illustrate that because the direction that you were exposed to could actually flip over, that meant you had to do the calculation twice. And maybe you were exposed to actually a number of variables that could go in opposite directions, so you could then you then actually have to do the calculation several times and take the worst of all of those. So kind of just simply showing that actually by simulating this you could fairly easily explore all of far more areas of all of that without actually having to make any of those judgments. Actually illustrated that you had something better. So yeah, I mean it was kind of a lot of work over a lot of time, and as I say, you really do find that different individuals do take a very different role, bring different perspectives. So as well as kind of blanket training, there would be individuals that would then spend time with as well that would want to really understand certain features of the model and so on.
Just one follow-up point on that. I think one of the main advantages of the simulation type approach is that you can actually pick out the simulations from your model which are giving rise to losses of round about the SCR, and pick a window and maybe there's 1,000 scenarios in there, pick some of them. You can actually then show them to the board, express them in real world terms. You've got an equity fall of 35%. People are living longer by 2 years. And that's something that you find you can have a conversation with people around. And it's not just a formula that you plug into a correlation matrix and get an answer out at the end and have to trust.
So Stephen or David, I mentioned at the outset, I find the decision around how many sample tests to carry out is particularly challenging. In 4.6.5.1, you say you're not aware of any specific approach to derive a theoretically robust number of scenarios to test, which is a shame. In practice, there's a limited modelling budget, and the more out-of-sample tests you do, the less runs you can use to actually fit the proxy model. So how do you go about judging the balance between how many runs you spend in either fitting the model or validating the model?
I think this is one that will come from experience, really, as a firm would inevitably build up a lot of empirical data by just fitting it over time. For a firm that's looking to do it sort of as an initial exercise, they would probably not be doing this in the reporting cycle, and so be able to do a little bit more in terms of we do this many scenarios, and this tells us that this allows us to draw what conclusions. I think it will come down to a firm's materiality thresholds and how happy they want to be. There are some statistical analyses that can be performed, but as Jonathan mentioned, they rely on errors being random, which is not always the case. So there's a sort of limitation to how much weight you can place on those. I think ultimately it is a balancing act, which will depend on a particular firm and the characteristics of their balance sheets. If some risks or some elements of the balance sheet have sort of very strange responses to particular risk factors, then that will inevitably require further additional fitting to capture. There are, there's some other work by Chris Hersey and Rebecca Scott, where they have techniques to sort of derive optimal fitting and validation points for univariates, which can help strike a balance and obviously identify the particular scenarios to validate that in order to get the bounds and the errors for particular loss functions, and refer to that in the paper. So that can be helpful as well. But in terms of particular sort of overall testing of the model, it does come down to the uses of it, in particular what areas to test, and the different materiality thresholds and how happy you want it to be.
Okay, we've probably time for one last question, if anyone's got a burning question.
Hello there. I would like to make two observations. First one concerns the point that Alistair just discussed about the choosing the number of scenarios for out-of-sample proxy validation, which I think, if I'm reading the paper correctly, 4.6.5.2, please don't all turn to it, they're quoting about a median number of scenarios used by insurers of about 50. This seemed an incredibly low number to me, given the high dimensionality of the risk drivers, which is typically up into the tens. So even allowing for a bit of targeting on use of things like biting scenarios and the expert knowledge of the actuary. The point being that in these high dimensions we're usually dealing with edge cases, and there are an awful lot of edge cases which give rise to the SCR case. Second observation, the paper recommends the use of R squared and the mean squared error in 4.6.7 with an R squared target of 1, just making the observation that when you use techniques such as least squares Monte Carlo, the target of 1 isn't attainable because of the noise in the inner valuations. In these instances, comparison of R squared between an out-of-sample and an in-sample data set can help to develop confidence that the fit is a good fit. Thank you.
Right, thank you for that. At this point, I'd like to ask Rebecca MacDonald to close the discussion. Rebecca's a senior consultant at PwC based in Edinburgh, where she carries out a lot of large audit and insurance engagement, in particular around the Solvency II balance sheet and economic capital methodology and results. She is a very lucky person. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, as we've already alluded to tonight, there's been quite a large volume of academic and research papers and publications in recent years as we transition from ICA to ICAS Plus into the Solvency II internal model. And actually I think the Working Party paper has been very welcome in its focus on a lot of the practical issues associated with the Copula plus Proxy model approach that we've seen many internal model firms adopt and go live for the first time at year-end just past. It's certainly provided much for discussion this evening, so I'll keep my comments brief that we can all get away on time. I think David this evening has touched on dealing with tail dependence and setting the correlation assumptions. And the worked example he took us through this evening was helpful, and actually sections 3.7 to 3.9 of the Working Party paper go through in a very systematic way a number of other practical considerations, and are very helpful, I think, in thinking through how to communicate the implications of this key assumption to a number of stakeholders. Andrew has highlighted the potential for further research into the simulation methods or into the fitting methods for the copulas, into using some actual or simulated data, and I think that definitely would be of interest, and it'll be good to see where that might go. Stephen touched on the validation of proxy models, and many companies would think around the validation of the copula in the context of the wider model. There's been some discussion around out-of-sample testing, and as Alistair has highlighted, this does need to be balanced against the actual fitting scenarios, because the modelling time is very much restricted, particularly in on-cycle at year end. One of the key questions asking in any validation, as Stephen highlighted, has to be, can the model be improved, either within this cycle or actually more likely in the next cycles? And I think the more that first-line teams can be quite open in identifying areas where the fit of the model can be improved, particularly in further cycles, the more credibility that they're going to build with the stakeholders around embedding the model and really using it to drive business decisions. I think a key question in assessing the proxy models has to be the overall goodness of fit, stepping back from the detailed risk by risk or product assessments to look at the fit in key scenarios, and then being able to articulate that really clearly to the many stakeholders, to the validators, to the regulator, and also to the board. Because necessarily, if there's not time for a refit where a model fails validation, there's going to be a significant amount of expert judgment in addressing that. That's touched on in section 4.8 in the work, that's touched on in the paper, sorry, not in section 4.8, in an earlier section in number 4. And it is worth bearing in mind, if the model fails on cycle, if it's not passing the calibration tests, then really thinking through the expert judgment that has to be applied there and how to communicate that is another area where it would be interesting to see more research. Section 4.8 sets out a lot of the communication challenges associated with proxy models and the responses to each. From my experience, perhaps the most significant of these is understanding the potential error around the true result, particularly as a number of insurers have now built up complex models with the pre-calibration stage at Q3 that's then rolled forward onto year end that brings an additional layer of approximation and complexity. The Working Party highlight in their paper the full range of what potential audiences for communications relating to judgments and the aggregation of risks in the model. And they highlight the need for the communications to be clear, tailored to the needs of the audience, and for the essential information not to be obscured. As proxy model techniques continue to develop and embed, then our ability to articulate these inherent judgments and explain their significance in simple terms, as one of the questions touched on this evening, is absolutely key to realising the value of the investment that we've made in internal models and ensuring that the wider business has confidence in the results. I would like to add my thanks to the Working Party for preparing this paper. I think it's been a really helpful summary of current practice, and as the discussion tonight has shown, has obviously been very timely and touched on a lot of points that would merit further consideration.
Thank you, Rebecca. The authors say in 5.1 that the aim of the paper is to provide UK life insurance actuaries with some examples of techniques that could be used to test and justify recommendations relating to aggregation approach. I think they've been successful in that aim. I think all that remains is for me to express my own thanks, in particular to David and Stephen, Jonathan, Rebecca and all of you who contributed, and join me in thanking them in the usual way.